All right, well, we're going to jump right in. Apologize, I was out last week. I know Danny, I was listening though, so we got a little taste of theme for next year, so appreciate that. And hopefully your ears got a break from the dive into Deuteronomy. So we will continue on though. Believe it or not, this is our seventh class together on that because I do number those. And we're going to pick back up in Deuteronomy 17. 17. Which unfortunately means we're still a little bit behind. Uh, we don't have a bunch more classes scheduled together just yet, so we're going to press on these. Press on. That's another thing we've done. Yeah, I think we've had that one before. Okay, so we're going to pick up in 17. We're going to be talking about sacrifices and judgment in Deuteronomy 17. And I know it's been a little while, been a couple of weeks. This is actually kind of reinforcing what we already heard about in chapter 14. So we've talked about some of these things before. So he starts off with, again, kind of rewinding a little bit, as we've seen throughout the entire book so far. Do not sacrifice an ox or a sheep that has a defect or a flaw. So if you recall, just 2 weeks ago, last time we met, we talked about kind of one of those tangents that I happened to run down that maybe I shouldn't have. But in understanding that even the firstborn, even the things that are to be offered, sometimes are not perfect and sometimes are not worthy to be offered in that way, but that they still have value. So again, 2 weeks ago, if you remember, we talked about, okay, these are no longer eligible to sacrifice to God because they're not perfect. But you don't just cast them aside. You can still eat them. You just don't do that as part of the sacrifice and the worship piece that goes with it. Right. So we talked a little bit about how we have an inherent value, even when we're imperfect. So none of us are perfect enough to be considered in this way, but our imperfection still shows that we have a value to each other and certainly to Him. So, sorry for that little rewind. So don't sacrifice an ox or a sheep if it has a defect or a flaw. He goes on to say, if you have others that are worshiping other gods, so if there are people that are worshiping other gods, you need to investigate that. So don't make an assumption and go, you investigate. And the words following again in the NIV that I used, if you find it true and it's proven, then those people are being put to death. You will stone them. So a pretty significant thing happening here. God saying, I know you're going into the lands where I will have you overthrow these people. They're not worshiping the right way or the right God. Not gods, but God. So if you have people that are continuing down that path, right? So we know that the ones they're overthrowing, all of those people are getting wiped out. So it's not them. He's talking about the Israelites here. If somebody strays and starts worshiping other gods, you've got to investigate it. If it's true, and it can be proven that it's true, they've got to be stoned to death. This is very obviously a very significant, serious thing. It's not youthful and indiscretion time. There's the expectation. And the way that they're going to teach their children and their children's children is to hear this word over and over. These are the rules. This is what you do. Kind of scary. From my perspective, it would be very scary. So when you're trying to prove and investigate, you've got to figure out, okay, how do you prove these things? Well, typically that requires some witness. Somebody's got to have seen or heard or understood something. So here he starts breaking down into a witness is not one person. That's insufficient. You've got to have 2 to 3. And I'm sure we could say minimum, right? If you had 5 or 6, I doubt they're going to just talk to the first 2 or 3 and say, we don't need you, go away. But 1 is insufficient. So one person saying or accusing or providing evidence against someone else is not enough. It takes more than 1. Now, maybe that helps us understand a little bit of community and what we do in our worship and our togetherness. There's not a me and this person. Collectively, we get to be witnesses for all of us. which also kind of helps us stay on the path, in my opinion. Okay, so witnesses, at least 2 or 3, not just one. And like we've seen in some of the other pieces of Deuteronomy, the witnesses are the ones that will cast the first stones, which is, even more. So think about that for a second. The witnesses cast the first stone. So in other times, it's been the family members cast the first stone. It's pretty, again, to me, very remarkable that someone that's as close to you as they can be is the one that initiates the process of your death. I don't know how else to say that. That's harsh. It's very considerable. So in this case, the witnesses are the ones that cast the first stone or stones. And then everyone participates after that, right? So it's not just the 2 or 3 witnesses that carry it out to conclusion. Everybody participates after, but the witnesses start it. So to me, I'm thinking to be a witness against someone that is requiring death, that is a very serious position to be in. Not only are you going to provide witness of something that has been done possibly wrong, incorrectly, you're now going to be one of the first hands in that person's death. As a matter of the punishment, I don't really want to use that word. It sounds a little uncaring, but that's what's happening here. There's a punishment coming, and it begins at the hand of the witness that testified against these folks. Presumably, a witness will be somewhat close to these people to know to know what was going on. That word's not coming out today. Not enough energy for that. Okay, so just consider that the witness role is considerable. It's a big deal to be a witness. And remember, it's not just one. So there's multiple people that have to be in a position to see it, know it, and willing to say something and willing to be the witness. So certainly that doesn't always paint the picture that if somebody sees this, you're going to die. It's going to require at least 2 or 3 people that are ready to serve and be the witness and be the ones that begin carrying out the punishment that comes with it. So I just offer that up. There may have been people that were able to do some of these things and kind of, quote, get away with it, as we might term it today, because there's insufficient witnesses or those not willing to serve as the witness, knowing what it means. Lawrence has got a comment. He's coming to the microphone. It's excellent.
Clearly, this is punishment, but I don't believe that's the objective. The last sentence said, purge the evil from among you. And that's the purpose, yes, not necessarily to punish the person.
Correct. And more comment.
I was going to say, I feel greatly comforted by these rules, having been in a family where pedophilia was allowed to go on for generations unchecked. Having power in your word when that's all you have is important for safety and community.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And certainly in those situations, it gets, I can imagine it being more complicated, certainly in that time, because again, you've got to have people that are willing to stand up or speak up and be that witness, to have something actually happen, to make it better, to make it right. So a pretty weighty thing going on here that doesn't get a lot of coverage in the number of verses assigned to it, but very, very deep in explaining what it is we need to do on an individual basis, and then understanding our role in the greater pool of people in our community. We have responsibilities, but they're not light. They're very serious and very, very deep. Okay, so then we start speaking about law courts. So courts of law, as we would typically call it today. And he acknowledges sometimes there's going to be a case that's just too difficult to figure out, too difficult for the judge that's been appointed to do, to be able to actually pass judgment. So there's a prescription here that the Levitical priests will assist. And I that's my word, assist. It's the priest with the judge will work together and provide a verdict. So again, even back then, it's anticipated there'd be things too difficult for any one person on occasion to be able to figure out and feel comfortable that they're getting it right. And I'm applying our current viewpoint of what a judge is and does to what was happening in Deuteronomy times. But I think the logic probably follows. This person is set up to be a judge of things that are accused or claimed. And if they're acknowledging there sometimes it's just going to be too tough for that one person to figure it out or to feel confident that they've got it right. So the priests are going to help. So there's a little bit of, hey, there's some good stuff there. It's not just one person. Now you're getting into the priest side of things and their role. That's their training. That's their job, right? So you need to have some kind of surgery. Well, sometimes we say, I want the chief of that department to do my surgery. And it's just like what I do. I'm not the one putting my hands on that every day and being good at it. Maybe I used to, but I have a different role now, and supervising things isn't the same as having hands-on doing it repeatedly. The people that have the muscle memory and the routine of it are generally more suitable for doing that part of the work. So in this case, when a judge who should be hands-on it every day doing it gets stumped, I'm seeing some comfort here that they're going to the priests who are spending, like they don't go out and farm during the week and do priestly things on the weekends. That's all they do. So they're even more ingrained in the rights and the wrongs and the actual laws that they're trying to live on. So I think there's some really good stuff there that it helps us see, again, sometimes not one person, just like the witnesses. Sometimes it needs the input of others, and those others are highly qualified because that's all they do is study and know the word. And so when they make that decision is binding. There's no arguing, there's no appeals courts and all of the things that we've set up here in our flavor of the world. And you must follow their decision. So it's binding. It is what it is. And you go from there. Anyone that shows contempt for the judge or the priests in these situations will be put to death. I don't recall that it goes into detail about how. Stoning seems to be the typical way this happens. I don't recall that it talked about who cast the first stone in this situation. I don't know as that it needed to. Our bottom line here is there's a judgment made. If the judge can't do it themselves, it's by grouping with priests to assist them. What they decide is binding. You have to follow what it says. And if you have contempt for them, we could probably, well, I don't know how we would figure out what contempt would be translated from then and what that word meant in that time. How serious is this contempt? What is it? Do you just say, I disagree and that's contempt? Or my guess is because they've just painted the picture of the decision's binding and you must follow it, that if you don't do those pieces, you're likely in contempt. Not just vocalizing your displeasure at their judgment and their finding. That's again my assumption. I don't know how we would really be able to dig in and figure that part out. Just too many years have passed and no great record keeping, obviously. A little hard to do. But I think that's probably what this language here is following. It's giving us decisions final, follow it. And if you have contempt, probably means you're not doing those things. So certainly judgment's passed. And if you don't comply with it, well, you're okay. Then what was the point? So this is where it comes in. This is the weight behind whatever the punishment of the judgment is. If you're contempt against that and don't do it, that's worthy of death. So not only is it giving us this balance of right and wrong and righting the wrongs, but it again is also describing the roles again and again and again. Your role is to listen and follow and do. And if you don't, it's worthy of death, because this is about how to live and structure your life. That's what it seems to me. All right, so that was law courts. Next, we get into a strange word for us: kingship. Kings, we don't deal too much with kings around these parts. We know of them from other countries. Generally, none that touch us outside of water. So we don't have a lot of real deep seated history with us and someone being a king over us. Again, other than what we see in other countries. What's notable to me, well, asterisk means my thought, not what came from the actual scripture. This tells me that it's okay to appoint a king because he's prescribing how it's to be done. So God's even telling us it's okay if you set a king up over you. Now, we know throughout the Bible we've seen, okay, you don't really need this, but if you think you do, here's how you do it. This seems to continue that mindset. So you can appoint a king, but it will be the one who God chooses. So it's not voting, it's not my family versus your family. We have more, so we win, and this is the king now. God shapes who can be considered for this. They must be an Israelite, so it will not be as foreigner as the terminology is here. And when they become king, they must not acquire a great number of horses. Okay, so we kind of know that horses had a different value. Certainly today, the automobile has displaced our placement of value of the horse, but the horse was mostly the transportation. There were others. I'm sure they could ride some camels and donkeys and such. We know about that. But horses were the thing, right? That was the sports car. So a king was not to acquire a great number. You could have some, obviously. They needed to get around. They needed to be able to use them in the way that they do. But you couldn't have too many, because that might lead your heart astray. This king was not to make the people, the Israelites, return to Egypt to get more horses. So the whole point of that, don't go back to Egypt again. Remember, the people he's talking to at this moment weren't in Egypt. Those were all generations past. Many generations past, with all of the wandering in the deserts and such. So these folks, we've talked before, they don't have the personal experience of being in Egypt and being in that situation, nor of leaving the way they did. But he's telling them again, do not go back to Egypt. Just don't do it. It took some effort to get them out of Egypt. Let's don't just go step back into it. Let's see if we can just walk out this time. Pretty sure they're hearing the same history lessons. Pretty sure they're not going to be real thrilled if an Israelite comes back into Egypt and they're going to, oh, you're back. I don't think they're ready to rent out the inn. They've got a nice jail cell waiting for them, most likely, if they even get that far or stay that long. Okay, the king is also to not take many wives. Oh, we got a comment. Yeah.
Testing. Yeah. Well, before we go very much away from that,
Yeah.
I think it would be good to point out that from this point forward in Israel's history, horses, and I believe this is the case here, horses represent military strength.
Mm.
So by having many horses, you begin to rely on your military strength rather than God. And I actually believe that the idea here of going to Egypt is, let's just go. I mean, they did something to us. Let's go do something to them. And in the process, we'll get some more horses. I believe this is one of these things where it's okay to have a king. Right now, Moses is in charge, or right now, Joshua will be in charge. And maybe one of these days you'll decide someone else should be in charge and that will be a king. They're supposed to do just like Moses. God takes care of these things. They're supposed to do just like Joshua. Be strong and courageous. I'm going to take care of this.
Right. Very good points. Thank you. Always appreciate having the broader perspective as we talk through these things. The military piece of that, I easily seen. Yeah, I think you're right on with that very much. Okay, so kings also not to take many wives. We knew in this time frame it wasn't always a monogamy thing with one husband, one wife. Back then they did things a little differently. Well, they do things differently than we do here today. But again, the words here are, don't take many wives because it may or will lead your heart astray. So your focus goes away from being godly or from thinking community and thinking about self instead. That seems to me to be kind of the point of that piece. They're also not to accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Very likewise, when you start to amass these things that have great value and indicate everything you have, the broad expanse of everything you can do, how powerful am I based on my bank account? That's not the desire here. It's okay to have some, but don't have so much that you set yourself up to be proud, as we've heard talked about in the previous chapters. Again, another piece of leading your heart astray. Your focus becomes on the material, on the human things, which certainly we can easily apply to our daily lives today too. And when the king takes the throne, this is interesting, they must write a copy of this law that's being given or received from the Levitical priests. They've got to make a copy of the law. And they have to keep it with them. And they have to read it every day. These are the things he says. If you're going to have a king, here's some things. Oh, and by the way, this king is going to remember who's actually in charge and whose laws and whose directives are going to keep them and their whole community going the right way. You're going to make a copy of the law. You're going to keep it with you all the time. You're going to read it every day. The king maybe isn't getting a lot of influence from their generations to teach them and remind them daily of all of their history because they're the king, you know. So they're going to write it down and they're going to read it. That's the expectation of a king. And they have to be careful not to consider themselves better than their fellow Israelites. So again, the proudness, I have arrived, I'm the king, you shall all bow and I will do nothing but point and make a scepter and all of the things that we envision. He's very clear here. You're no better than anybody else. You're just kind of the steward. You're the facilitator. You're keeping us going down these paths. And quite honestly, again, asterisk means my thought here. This seems very similar to the judges and the appointment process for a judge and what's expected of them and their role, and not expanding it to be, I'm the great judge or I'm the great king. You have a role, you plug into this spot on your organizational chart. Here you are. It doesn't have to mean a whole lot more than that. Things can fall up to you. Maybe you make some decisions. That's fine. God's still in charge. Remember that thing you're making a copy of and looking at and carrying around with you and reading every day. That's it. So in this place, the kingship portion seems to follow very closely to what a judge appointment looks like as well. To not be developing yourself in such a way that here I am, look at me. This very much still plays into what has God set out for this position to do, this role. And that brings us to the end of the 17. And that took a lot longer than it needed. So on to 18, my friends. Okay, so chapter 18 starts off with offerings for the priests and the Levites, which are really kind of one and the same. The Levites are the priests. So he reminds them the whole tribe of Levi has no inheritance and no allotment. God has not given them this chunk of land or these things that grow in it or graze in it. They don't have any of that. So they live on the food offerings that are presented to God. Okay, and a portion of those sacrifices are actually prescribed for their use. And it's very specific in what portions are for them to have. I find that interesting. So the shoulder, the internal organs, and meat from the head of the animals that are sacrificed, those particular pieces are set aside for the Levites. That's how they will exist and survive. The first fruits of the grain, the new wine, the olive oil, and the first wool from the sheep shearing, probably of the season, all of those are set aside for the Levites. That's after they've been offered as a sacrifice. So it's not, I'm going to march this pile of wool over here that I did the first cut, and I'm going to hand it to the priest and on my way into town. No, this is part of the sacrifice. So it all still goes into God's house, God's presence. The sacrifice is made, but then, as we know, kind of from the interior, exterior pieces of tabernacling, the common person who provides the sacrifice doesn't actually see what's happening. That's behind curtains that they're not allowed to go past or even see in. So at least he's telling them here, when you give these things to sacrifice to God, the priests take them into the certain areas inside the tabernacle. A portion of that's going to be used by the Levites to actually survive. So it's kind of that transparency today word. It's that full disclosure. Okay, don't be upset when you see the Levite out at the side of the tabernacle tent having a little bit of a meal shortly after you took something in to be sacrificed and thinking they're not sacrificing to God as they're supposed to, which may put you in jeopardy. He's telling them right now, they get some of these things. This is how they're going to survive because I haven't given them anything else. This is part of the process he's set up. Interesting things. Why those specific pieces of the animal, I don't know. Shoulder, internal organs, and meat from the head. Possibly there's something there that's the front half of the animal. I don't know. I don't know. Seems odd that the rest would be consumed in whatever sacrifice piece it is. But if we know anything about God, he's obviously got it figured out. It's a certain way because that's how he wants it or needs it and expects it. But I wouldn't stand here and tell you that I think the front half of the animal is more valuable or more desirable than the back half, just in the way our little minds think. I'd be pretty sure that's not what's happening. So it's got to be something else, right? We can kind of process of elimination that one out. God's not taking the hind end of the animal because it's less desirable. Pretty sure that's probably not what he's doing. What it does mean, I can't tell you. I don't know. We can conjecture a lot of things. Doesn't make them right. Okay, so he continues on with occult practices. This is a very short section here. Again, reminds us back to a few chapters ago. Do not sacrifice your sons or daughters. We talked about that a little bit extensively before because they were taking over lands from people that were doing that. And he was very clear in saying, don't do that. Why on earth would you do that? Why in the heavens would you do that? These are your offspring. This is what continues your ability to function and to live. They're also not to engage in divination or sorcery, interpret omens, engage in witchcraft, cast spells, a medium or a spiritist who consults the dead. So there's acknowledgement that there must be some of that going on, or it wouldn't be mentioned here. So it's not a foreign concept to them. And again, we know of these things, maybe not a lot of firsthand knowledge. It's not rampant in our society. But we know about them. If nothing else, we know about them from Hollywood, which is not a great place to get your learning, certainly. That's usually wrong in many, many ways. But at least we can identify, we can think of things that these words trigger. Whatever they are, it's that otherworldly, supernaturally kind of thing. And God's saying, there's no place for that. Mostly I would believe there's no need for any of that. You've got God. You don't need anything else. That's kind of an easy one. He is it. He is sufficient. You don't need these things. And certainly if they're going to tell you to sacrifice sons or daughters, you just set that aside right now. There's in no instance that that's going to be a good thing to do. In case you were wondering, don't do it. Probably a lot of these things throughout Deuteronomy, we can just preface that with, in case you were wondering, here, this, do this, do that. And then next we get into the prophet section. So he reminds them again, don't listen to sorcerers or divinations. Okay, so these people exist. We know that. We've heard that with this getting the water from the rock, that a sorcerer could do certain things. We know that from the Ten Commandments movie, that a sorcerer can turn their staff into a serpent. We know that. So they existed. And he's saying, you know what? They're out there. You don't need to listen to them. They're not providing any value here. They're not going to tell you anything that's of value that you're not hearing from me. And if they're saying something different than me, you certainly don't need to listen to that. And then he says, God will provide a prophet from within Israel. And just as you Israelites asked way back at Mount Horeb, they said, and we talked about this way early on, many, many weeks ago, the people said, we don't want to hear from God directly anymore. Every time that happens, we get in a lot of trouble. A whole lot of trouble. So, God, please don't talk to us anymore. Only put someone in between us. We don't want to hear directly from you anymore, okay, Dad? Can you let Mom be the one to tell us we're in trouble? That's kind of how I think of it. So when they said, please don't have God talk to us as the Israelite nation directly anymore, or we will die, they understand. We are not worthy to hear it directly. We mess up way too much to hear this directly. We need an intermediary. And we know that Moses went and pled for the Israelites over and over. Please don't kill them. Please give them another chance. Please let me help. Please show me how I can help them. Over and over. So they acknowledge that's a good position to have. So there will be a prophet that God will provide so that can continue. And God will tell the prophet what to say. No big surprise there. But note that if a prophet speaks extra or has spoken something God has not said, that person is to be put to death. That prophet is to be put to death. So then, this is not asterisk, so this isn't my thinking, but it would have been. Well, how do you know? How are you supposed to know? Someone's standing up as the prophet that's appointed and provided. How are you supposed to know if they're telling you the truth or not? If they're adding things or if they're not telling you the right things? How do you know? So the scripture tells us if the proclamation does not take place or does not come true, then it's not what God spoke. So it's kind of proof in the pudding time. Okay, if the prophet says this and it doesn't happen or it's wrong, there's your answer. The judgment can be made from that. Again, probably looking at the witness cycle thing, probably not a one-on-one thing. The prophet said something and I heard it this way and it didn't happen, so I'm going to go kill him. Probably not. Probably takes 2 or 3 at least to actually conclude that was in fact what happened. Now, I got a double asterisk note here. So my thought, maybe a little out there. That's why there's 2 asterisks. So if the prophet tells you something's going to happen or not going to happen, or do it this way or do it that way, and the only real way we're supposed to know as the people receiving that information, the only way we're supposed to know if it's right or wrong is whether it comes true or not. So how do you that leads me into a kind of a trap, because some of the things certainly that we deal with, and most likely they did too, were some long range things. In the future, this will happen. You will this, and this will become that. So the way you prove this up for your prophet being right and the true prophet kind of tells me it's time limited, because it can't be something they're telling you is going to happen in 200 years. We won't still be alive, nor will the prophet, because they are still just human. He's not saying the prophet will have everlasting life or until I find another one. So there's a time limiter here. While this person is serving as a prophet, if they're telling you things, they really can't tell you things 100 years from now, because there's no way to validate that they're true, that they're a true prophet. So it kind of tells me the role of the prophet, as we make it somewhat grand. I think this prophet he's talking about most likely isn't what we consider the prophet, right? So it's got to be something shorter duration. How do you know they're telling you the truth if you can't see it to conclusion? That's a double asterisk, just food for thought, because it's puzzling. But it just kind of leads me to think this particular piece of discussion about a prophet is not what we would consider the prophets with Jesus, or considering Jesus as the prophet. I think much different than what this is talking about. This was much earlier on. So I offer that up for your thought and consideration to ponder, as it's been rattling around in my head for a little bit, and I don't have a clear answer. Any thoughts on that? Because we're about out of time and I really can't start the next one. But I can't let you go this early. Feels like getting out of school early. Can't do that.
Or, yeah, that's weird. You can't, bleh. Maybe there's multiple, like maybe God is talking to the nation about multiple things at one time. He does give them, future this, future that, but nothing new that hasn't already been said. But anyways, when he's like, hey, go to this guy, go to this nation, do this, I'm about to do this. If a prophet who said that does screw up, and that I'll probably, and he also has previously said forever things, maybe you just, yeah, that's weird. That's a weird one.
Yeah.
You're welcome for that comment.
We tend to, in our modern way of thinking, want the prophet to be a fortune teller, but really wasn't what it was with God. It was, I'm talking to you, you go pass this along. And it was mostly be obedient. Here's the law. Here's what you're supposed to do. So in that sense, Moses was a great prophet kind of thing. The other thing I wanted to say was back in, I think it was verse 12 of 17, when you were talking about that word that you weren't quite sure of, concerning that they would be killed if they didn't do this. What was that word?
Yeah, I was just
Contempt. Yes.
contempt. Yeah,
shows
that's
contempt. So I was back there digging into the Hebrew, and it is a prideful arrogance that refuses to comply.
very good. So that gives us a great deal of context around contempt.
Along the lines, I think, of what they have both said, they are to anticipate that God will speak to them. It may be Moses, maybe Joshua, but a prophet will arise when needed.
Right.
And that's their, as Danny was saying, their job is not to tell the future. Their job is to talk to you about what I have to tell you. Now that may include some future things, but so long as they're consistently seen as speaking from God, that's God's business, not mine.
Right.
I think is one of the ways we need to look at it. They should anticipate God's revelation to them when it's necessary, and don't necessarily want to listen to just everybody that's talking.
Very true. Very good. All right. Any other comments? My Zoomer friends?
Only one.
Oh, one more. All right.
He's not to be held responsible for everything he says, just those things that he proclaims in the name of the Lord.
Okay. Very good. So a good distinction there too for the prophet is when they tell you they're speaking on behalf of God.
One of the concepts that's interesting to me biblically is that God is all sufficient. I don't like that word. That doesn't sound like plenty, doesn't sound like enough, because I think here a lot of the times we get enough and we don't want enough. So I wonder if when we think prophet, we think they got all of it. They got to say, huh, or why, when they probably felt like that's enough. That do what? Huh? So I'm sufficient. It's a weird.
Yeah. Kind of gets into the doing the minimum, right? We give you sufficient information to function. You don't need the rest. Maybe there isn't the rest. Most likely the prophet that hadn't been given the rest because didn't need it. Do this, right? So that's that inquiring minds want to know. Well, okay. Pick that up at the checkout stand, or I guess subscribe to it online. I should say it that way now. So, okay. Well, that'll bring us to the close today, unless we got a Zoomer. Just wave if you have something else to offer up. Nope. Okay. Well, very good. We will see you again next week. Thank you very much.